So today I'm hosting an interview with Dr. Anastasia Burkovskaya, who is a senior lecturer here at UCIT, and her research mainly focuses in decision economics and econometrics. So
Mostly microeconomics theory
yeah.
nowadays, but yeah.
So I guess my first question would be, what inspired you to take a career in economics, and would you say that there's anything today that makes it especially easy to figure out what a student would want to study?
Okay, so that's actually a difficult and pretty much long journey for me because I started my undergraduate degree and actually did the entire degree in computer science and applied mathematics, which in Russia it's like a 5-year degree, so it's kind of undergraduate with masters together. But when I was kind of getting close to the end of my studies, I was already working full-time in consulting. And, well, in Russia, if you want to live in Moscow and you are not from Moscow, essentially that's what you have to do. And I started realizing that the job gets really boring really soon. Essentially, after like half a year, you figure out how everything works, and everything else, every single time you do the same thing over and over and over and again in all of the projects. So I was really, really bored at that point, and there was some gossip around this new economics school that gives, at that point, it was working only for master's degree, where they just take all of this, great students from math, computer science, physics, and train them really quick, really hard to be really good economists. And so I thought, well, maybe that's something I should try. It might be interesting. And especially it was kind of advertised, or at least like between students, it was like, oh, you can go and do career abroad. And at that point, I'm not from a rich family or something. So like most students actually there. So it sounded like super amazing. So I was like, yeah, okay. That sounds good. I might want to try and do that. And so I did get accepted into the new economics school. And at the point when I was going in there, I thought, oh, I will go and work in some investment bank afterwards. We'll make a lot of money. And that was kind of my career vision. But when I actually started studying economics, I did find it quite fascinating. Many aspects of it, many different fields. We were exposed to a lot of different fields very quickly. And during my study, I realized that I really enjoyed doing research.
Was that part of your course, sorry? Or was it just additional?
We were writing theses, and in many courses we also did a lot of term papers and stuff like this. And then also previous graduates sometimes would come, especially like from academic careers, and come and talk about how they went to US to study PhD and how career in academia is like just fantastic. So I did realize that at some point that I do enjoy doing research. So I do enjoy figuring out some question, digging around it, trying to solve something. I am a mathematician by nature, so that naturally made me a theorist rather than an applied person. But yeah, I realized that that's something I really like. At that point, I wasn't sure about my field completely yet, because I was really like learning so much from different fields. I was really interested in development. I thought I would probably do macroeconomics. I was all over the place, but then when I went for PhD in US at UCLA, somehow macroeconomics was really boring for me there. Not for many other people, but I did find that the way it was taught in Russia was a lot more interesting, or at least the way the models we were seeing was more interesting for me, like as a theorist. And I naturally converged into kind of microeconomic theory and modeling, and to some extent econometrics. My main advisor was actually an econometrician. I went away from econometrics after that. Somehow I converged more to becoming microeconomic theorist. But definitely, even in terms of econometrics, I would be interested in like, okay, let's model something and maybe figure out how to estimate it, like non-parametrically, not with the standard ways. So that's my journey, really. Yeah.
You sound like you've done a bit of like everything in terms of economics, from like research to maybe wanting to do investment banking to econometrics to management consulting.
Yeah.
What kind of like scope or I guess range would you say this subject of economics can take you? Because you've done so much, and would you say that would apply to different careers?
I think economics is fantastic in terms of choice for like major of study, exactly because how broad it is. So being a student out of the high school, you really don't know what you end up doing. You don't know. Even like, for example, in Russia, it's actually the problem of Russian education, where you pick a department, right, and you just follow through your study. You cannot even choose elective courses. Your study is all like, I think we had 2 units that were elective in like 5 years of God knows how many subjects. So it's really, it's good because from one perspective, because you follow through with the same cohort. So you actually make friendships and you stay with those people, but you don't get to choose. And so essentially being like 17, 18-year-old, you're trying to commit to a career, which you don't even know the world. You don't know. Like at that point, for example, I had no idea about economics at all, right? Like you don't know what you end up doing. And so from this perspective, doing economics is actually a great field because it allows you all of this flexibility of choices, right? You can do consulting, you can work for government, you can work for NGOs, you can work in like development, macroeconomics, all kinds of micro, you can go and work in Amazon. Essentially, it gives you an opportunity to sell yourself, I'm a smart person, and I can help you do whatever you want to do. Yeah, probably you wouldn't be doing science per se, like, physics or developing, I don't know, new chemical elements or something like this, obviously not. But in any kind of management or consulting where it needs to be some kind of organization and strategic thinking or thinking about efficiency, that's pretty much a career for an economist.
Because there's such a large scope, would you say that there's any tools or skills that students should learn beforehand? Because of course they don't know the exact field that they want to study or like the specific niche. So would there be any general skills, for example, like Excel or anything of that nature that you would recommend?
We don't do Excel. I think Excel might be fantastic for accounting or maybe for some specific other jobs, right? But in economics, we don't really use Excel. In terms of applied skills, we use data for estimation. Well, not necessarily, like it could be also Python or R. I use MATLAB, I'm an old person already. But in terms of skills, are you asking about going into economics degree to prepare for economics degree? Or okay, so in this way, do your math. Don't avoid math. It will make your life way much easier. It will open a lot more opportunities for you. In terms of thinking about career after undergraduate degree, which is, I guess, a question for many people, usually people who can do stats, data kind of work, applied work, would be the most valuable. It means you need to understand math to some degree. And also to do economics courses, you got to know your derivatives, really.
Would you say that that's for like every university or just like UCITS especially?
No. It's in general a good advice to give to any student that wants to do economics. And I would say don't get scared by math, because I know some students just like want to avoid it, never do it in their life. But trust me, if you just put an effort, learn your derivatives, learn some basic stats, well, we actually teach them, but put an effort into those, it will pay off.
And a common, I guess, stereotype is that professors tell their students to read up on the newspapers, for example, like the Economic Times. Would you say that because I'm hosting a book reading channel, so book and literature, would you say that literature, like reading, for example, the news and catching up on business and politics and economics, is important for preparation?
I mean, it's not necessary because it's not. We don't test you on those things. Obviously, we teach you pretty much all economics. We don't expect you to have any knowledge from school of economics, etc. But maybe generally, if you are trying to figure out what you're interested in, it might be a good idea to read something, right? Like advice I was given back then when I was applying for my master's degree in economics: read The Economist. And that was a really good advice in terms of trying to understand the world. Not everything there is 100% correct. Now I would say as an academic economist, but it is a good journal, and it gives you a broad range of topics and kind of can help you understand the world and different areas. Because economics, usually people think about economics, what is macroeconomics? Is, you know, RBA talking about rates, inflation, that's all our concerns. Or basically all kinds of prices, housing market. But that's only macroeconomics. It's a massive field, but it's like this, and economics is like this. So it's just small part, and The Economist covers a lot of different things.
Other than the newspapers and like news, like for example, The Economist, would you say, because a lot of unis, they have recommended reading for in terms of like books, would you suggest, like, would there be any books in particular that you suggest people read?
Well, I guess there is, nothing comes into my mind immediately, but there is a large popular literature that you can read depending also of your interest. There is a lot of behavioral kind of Kahneman and Teperski kind of style, right? Or there is a lot about macroeconomy, especially from like US perspective, for example. You can read Alan Greenspan, or Bernanke had a book recently, etc. So it is good. It's good to read a bunch of those suggested things because they also give you perspective of different field and what people work on.
I guess moving on to a bit of your research, I was wondering, because you've explained kind of the journey of your education and how you grew up from Russia to study economics and become an academic. In terms of like more specifically for the topics of your research, how has that kind of like fluctuated? Did you always stay in one side, or did you move around? And then kind of what area do you specialize in now after all that?
It's always for me a travel all over the place because as a PhD student, you're still very immature, right? And you're trying to figure out your research agenda, but because there is so much pressure to write the dissertation, right? And like job market paper, because that's what we do as academic economists, right? You don't actually concentrate on what is your field. In general, you have a field, but like smaller kind of side of the field. You're just trying to survive, really. I probably shouldn't be saying this, but that's reality for most of people when they're PhD students. And you also don't see perspective very well at that point. And so I started, I tried to do actually some topics that is completely new and didn't exist in economics. I totally failed, which my advisors told me that you will likely fail. It's a very complicated question. And so I had like 1 year left to write, actually even less, to write my job market paper. So I just ended up doing something with preference that kind of worked out. So it took me into modeling preferences in limited attention, limited focus, those kind of things. And later this strain of my research developed into a really nice publication when we applied this to insurance context. And actually, if you read the paper, you will kind of blame me for being this capitalist that's helping firms to increase profit based on, limited focus of consumers. But it doesn't need to be seen from this perspective, really, because it's also good for governments to understand those things, right, to prevent that kind of behavior. So it's not always that economists, even when we're trying to maximize profit for firms, it doesn't necessarily we're trying to help firms. So that's just one strain of research. I'm doing a little bit also of different topics in political economy from all over this place, mostly what personally interests me. So right now, actually, I'm writing an empirical paper about electoral fraud. This one I finally got my hands on. Hopefully it will be finished soon. But that comes from my background from Russia, right? I don't know how much you follow the news and stuff, but Russian elections have been known to be exceptionally bad with back then ballot stuffing. Nowadays they just, draw the numbers, so there is nothing you can do here. But at that point, me being younger, it was a lot about actually ballot stuffing, where polling station officials just fill in ballots and drop them into the urn. And I think I came up with fairly nice way of how to evaluate that, which doesn't exist in the literature. And essentially the point here, okay, we drop in ballots for the incumbent party, but the number of people who voted for everyone else is actually truthful. So we can use that.
Oh, right.
Right? Shares, of course, are wrong, but we're going to work with the number of people, or like proportion over the registered voters in that particular polling station. And so I use this information to evaluate some kind of unobservable variable that tries to capture, parts of unobserved ideology, unobserved cost of voting, all of those things we cannot control them. And so I try to evaluate this for all polling stations. And then if we have good exit poll in some of the polling stations in some region, for example, or in my case, what I use in the paper for the application in 2011 parliamentary elections in Russia, other researchers actually assigned independent observers randomly to a number of polling stations in Moscow. And they brought a nice paper based on this. But I do have access to that data, right? So I know actually truthful data in those polling stations. And that allows me to compare, controlling for this unobserved variable that I recover, what is the difference. So how kind of bad and dirty polling stations differ from the clean ones, and it gives quite a nice function. Actually, it looks like a little bit like a parabola, surprisingly, because it's completely non-parametrically estimated. That thus says that, for example, where ideologically polling station is more leaning towards Putin, they're gonna throw in more. So that's something that I'm finishing hopefully this paper really soon.
So that would be independent to your paper about the new democracies, right? About monetary policy?
Yeah, so that actually agenda arises from my master's degree.
Oh, okay.
From ages ago. So that paper published, it was essentially my master's thesis, which I didn't do anything for ages, and then I thought, I received an award as a student for that paper. I got like A+ for it, and I thought, why don't I try to write it like a proper paper and publish? And there is actually a follow-up paper now. It's not published yet, but it's under review in some journal, where we change the angle from, this opposition trying to mess up the economy, which sometimes they might do that, to the focus of this balance between for independent central banker. Independence can be good because it can promote stability, right, of low inflation, etc. But then independence is bad during crises like COVID, right, because you actually want to throw in money into the economy and communicate with government. And so I'm trying to work out this balance between the two, how much, which countries we want to have independent central banks and which we don't.
Yeah, that was a really interesting paper, actually. Went a bit over my head, but I guess
it's okay.
Because I've also, I think I mentioned briefly in an email, but I worked on a little research paper about a similar topic, which is why I thought this was so interesting, because I looked at like fiscal spending during political budget cycles.
Yeah, so this is, it's actually a good strain of research on this, and including some papers about Russia that I'm aware of. Yeah.
So because this, I never thought about looking at monetary policy, which is why I thought this was so interesting, because for my paper, quite generally, I just found that expenditure increases in the weeks preceding an election, and then following that, the fiscal deficit decreases because they spend less. But I was wondering, could you explain for the audience, I guess, what the monetary business cycle is, and kind of how it fits in with fiscal policy into the kind of overall political budget cycle?
So in terms of when it comes to electoral cycles, right? Essentially, what government might try to do, especially if central bank is not perfectly independent, they would like some monetary expansion prior to elections. It is more complicated nowadays because most countries do have fairly independent central banks, right? And because of this, the only tools that governments really have is fiscal, right? Like they can do some government spending and throw in some money around before elections to increase the support, obviously. And a lot of literature actually does show that that works for the governments, right? It used to be, with monetary cycles, it used to be a thing that existed pretty much everywhere, but slowly countries started transitioning into independent central banks. So now you can see this more likely in countries that are not developed, that are developing. It did exist in Russia actually heavily in the 90s again, something I got to observe as a kid. Every time, maybe not the last elections of Putin because he ran out of money, but prior to that, he would, increase pensions. So that's a fiscal way to go about it. Or in 90s, nightmare was happening in monetary policy. We had hyperinflation, people were not getting paid at work, and they would just print money prior to elections and try to, increase all of those pensions and government worker salaries and stuff.
Yeah. Is that part of the reason that you looked into new democracies other than traditional ones?
Yeah, because currently most central banks start being independent, and governments still often try to affect their behavior through Twitter, like Trump, for example, or complaining about RBA. Here many people might do that as well. But that's, kind of outside pressure, sort of, but they cannot directly tell them to print money.
So I think you mentioned this earlier, but in the introduction to your paper about central bank independence, you asked a prompt to the reader, which I'm hoping to ask you to get your thoughts on, which was, why do you think some countries choose to establish an independent monetary authority, whereas others do not?
I think it has a lot nowadays with country development, really. But it's a difficult aspect because those things feed into each other, right? On the one hand, a stable democracy would probably want their central bank to be independent because they do understand that,
Different
a populist person might rule the country one day, and we don't want that populist to start printing money just to get elected. And these things can take any country down the slope. Like Argentina is a constant example of this kind of populist nightmare in macroeconomy, basically. And I guess it is a difficult question to answer, to be honest. But I guess it does have a lot to do with development, but it also helps development. Countries that do manage to establish independent central bank suddenly start doing better economically as well.
Yeah.
Kind of linking into that, because you mentioned the idea of countries developing, what challenges would you say that countries, especially authoritarian countries moving into these new democracies, would you say that there's any particular challenges that they face in terms of maintaining their integrity with the central bank independence?
Okay, so if we talk about Russia, because that's, a country I know really well about, surprisingly, Putin learned that macroeconomic stability helps him rule. And because of this, central bank is fairly independent. It cannot be fully independent into dictatorship, essentially, right? But he honestly tries not to intervene with central bank. He does use tools of fiscal policy, like trying to increase pensions and things like this. But that's a smart dictator, right? Because he knows that macroeconomic stability would actually prolong his term. But in many cases, usually historically, Argentina is a classical case of when some populist comes in power, they just start printing money and spending it, but it usually ends up in some kind of economic collapse every single time.
It's really interesting. Would you say that fiscal policy then is a more effective way to kind of do that electoral fraud, their monetary policy?
You mean electoral business cycle,
Yeah,
sort of?
sorry.
Well, I guess yes. I would think so. Because, well, because if you do fiscal spendings, right, what is the cost of it? Well, okay, you might get some government debt, right? But you can really tighten after the election, right, as you're saying. Versus monetary expansion has a price. Expectations of inflation rising, it naturally increases the overall inflation level. And if people start expecting it every single election, your monetary expansion is not going to do anything, right? But overall level of inflation will be higher.
Okay, that makes a lot of
They need
sense,
to be
actually.
smart about it.
Yeah.
Not all of them are.
No, not all of them are. About what you said earlier then about your work in like decision economics and looking at framing, I was wondering because in your paper about I have it here actually, but about framing and insurance choices,
Yeah.
that was quite an interesting like surprise to me because I wasn't expecting that, and most of my reading was about like I guess more pure economics in the sense that it looks at like micro and macro rather than I guess it's more behavioral, I would say.
It's actually quite a micro decision theory, but with a behavioral taste.
Yeah. So I was wondering about when you were talking about like deductibles in terms of the broad framing and then the narrow framing.
Yeah.
Could you kind of explain why consumers would choose more similar deductibles in those different contexts?
So yeah, I guess that does have a lot of behavioral aspect to it, and essentially I do have like 3 papers about it now, right? A difficult question. No, I would think that it's true. Because weak separability, what it talks about is essentially those kind of frames, right? How we perceive those frames. And I do feel like, for example, with insurance plans, we are forced to perceive them in some way by insurance companies. Or currently in Australia, all insurance plans are essentially standardized, right? So it's government, by some reason, decided that this is the frame you receive. But they could be different. Right, and if you live in some other country, insurance plans will look differently, and will be bundled differently with different like conditions, etc. And very likely, if you are living there, this is how you will perceive your frames.
So, because you also mentioned in your paper like this idea of regulation, because I know you mentioned earlier that you're not supporting the firms doing the framing, but you're also not supporting them. It's more for an observation, and then you also talked about the idea of regulation and how. I think it was either the Australian government or someone else who was proposing these ideas. Would you say that is something that should happen, or would you say framing is just a part of the market that we should accept?
Honestly, I don't know the correct answer to questions, should we regulate this or not? Because to answer this, we need to know that consumers are actually being heard through those things, right? And here, well, government right now is trying to intervene and standardize insurance plans, which is a good idea in terms of helping people to compare. Sure, they were so different that it was difficult to figure out what's going on. But for example, the particular way government chose to impose this frame on us, it was never studied why it should be this way. So we don't know whether, it does help to compare, so that part is good, but why should insurance plans to look exactly like this and not some other way?
Right.
That is unclear, and I don't know how government makes those decisions.
In your paper about state aggregation, which was a new term that I learned, actually, I had no idea that was
Well, that's a frame.
Yeah. Could you kind of explain what the premise of state aggregation was and how this event like affects economic agents in everyday
So
life?
this is exactly what we already were talking about. Is just the language develops with papers when you write them. So originally I started calling it state aggregation, but essentially it's a frame.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So I thought it was more specific in the sense that they like
No, I just
and then simplify.
Language develops when you develop in certain
Right,
area, right? And you learn to talk about it. So sometimes it takes several papers to come up with the right way of talking about it to people.
Would you say that like in all these examples of framing, like you said, in healthcare, in like insurance plans, is there any example of framing that you found particularly like effective that you've noticed before?
Well, I'm not an applied person, so I don't study real plans,
Right.
right? So I just
I mean, like
think
something more
about.
like every day though, like either like walking through somewhere and then seeing insurance plans or something like that.
Um, I mean, obviously, we're exposed a lot to health insurance plans, right? So that is actually a good example. And because I got to live in several countries, you see how differently they're actually framed. And then my co-author, she used to live in Canada, and that actually gave us this comparison of Australian and Canadian insurance plans, or dental insurance plans with like US and stuff. So that's why it ended up being like this particular example in the paper. But you can think about this kind of framing in all kinds of insurance context. The car insurance, right? I don't know, pet insurance also might have all kinds of conditions, or home insurance that can cover, I don't know, flood, robbery, etc. Those kind of conditions can be grouped or separated. Or like it could be natural disaster or another plan covering talking about floods separately from fires, for example. All of those are framings.
So sorry, just to clarify for myself, when you use the example of insurance, the ideal framing also applies to like other things as well, right?
In principle, yes, we were not able to come up with a clear example. It should work with asset market as well, but we were not able to come up with a really clear real life example of that. Theoretical, yes, sure, the way we teach it in economics, it's not a problem, but you know, to advertise your paper and introduction, you need to write about something that is real, and insurance was working the best. So in this sense, yeah, I do belong to mainstream economics, but I wouldn't put myself in any more stronger area than that.
Okay, well that's it from me then.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much for your
Yeah,
time.
sure, no problem.